Welcome back to The Shed. Tonight we go back to 1993 and the Hugo Award-winning novel for that year in Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars. We've got a different one here as well for those of you who enjoy different cover arts. And what a great novel it is. So what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll make some recommendations, we'll put it to the memory test, and I'll rank it on our Hugo and Nebula Award-winning Sci-Fi Shed ladder. So the year is 2026 and we have the first colonial trip to Mars on this spacecraft called Ares. And Ares is the biggest spacecraft, interplanetary spacecraft that humans have built to date. And these 100 wannabe colonists are comprised of primarily Russian and US citizens, with about 30% coming from all walks of life. And the first chapter begins with John Boone, who was the first person to ever have stepped on Mars, being assassinated. And we have Frank Chalmers, who happens to be one of his best friends, but also one of his rivals, coming to the forefront and basically asking the question, and what can I make of this now that John Boone's out of the way? The novel then goes into a retrospective examination of the events leading up to John Boone's assassination. So we're back on the spaceship Ares and we learn a little bit more about these 100 colonists. We learn a little bit more about the selection process, how they were selected, and we also learn about the little tricks that some of the individuals used to basically play the system to get selected. So once we land on Mars, the colonists immediately start on building the habitats that are going to contain them to get them outside of the harsh element and reality that is Mars. And the question almost comes up immediately, which is, what do we do about the atmosphere of Mars? And there's talk about terraforming the planet, and we find that two different fractions who are mutually exclusive goals start to form around what and how and if we should actually terraform Mars. So what we learn of the 100 is they almost immediately start challenging the limitations, the culture and traditions of Earth. And there are certain different groups who start to fracture away, thinking that, the old ways of doing things on Earth is just not going to work on Mars and we need to make our own way. And due to those principles, we found that the Martians are making some significant scientific discoveries, all of which put extraneous amount of pressure back on Earth and the population on Earth. So what we find is that things on Earth go from bad to worst, with increasing population, increased scarcity of natural resources, and they start just sending hundreds and thousands of colonists back to Mars to try to alleviate some of the pressure that's on the planet. And what they use is none other than Clark's space elevator to bring some of these migrants onto Mars, which I thought was fantastic, and we may talk to that in my likes and dislikes sections. And what we learn is that the exploding population on Mars is putting a whole lot of pressure on the colonists. And with John Boone dead, they're seeing this as an opportunity to start a revolution against Earth. So with Mars and Earth at war, the question really is, will the terraforming efforts that we've started continue? Will we be able to make Mars a habitable planet without having to live within these enclosures? What about the extra pressure there is on Earth? Would that be alleviated? Is there hope for humanity on the red Mars? So I know that was a pretty quick overview for what is almost a 700-page novel, but it really does, I think, cover the premise of the novel and what you're coming into, which is this first 100. It really talks about their lives on the planet, these first 100. The challenges of building a Mars colony ground up, them having to deal with opposing scientific and moral views around what we do about terraforming this planet, them building the technologies to be able to get migrants onto the planet, other colonists onto the planet, and exchange goods with other settlements like the Earth and the Moon. And also talks about individual politics and individual conflict. So look, really, it is a wonderful novel, this big old chunky 700-page novel by Kim Stanley Robinson. But what did I like in particular? Look, so many times reading through this novel, you ask yourself, has Kim Stanley actually been to Mars, right? Because he paints this wonderful picture of what the landscape may look like on Mars. And I'm not going to preach on here saying that he's got it scientifically correct, because I'm no scientist. And I suspect that it's not quite as he imagined it, but I did really like the picture that he paints. For me, it's very reminiscent of Arthur C. Clarke. I thought Arthur C. Clarke was always great when it comes to building this imagery of what you may see on a planet like the Moon or Mars, like he has done in the past. And I think Kim Stanley just follows that tradition where it's just a wonderful scenic view of what you'd expect Mars to look like. And I think he did a wonderful job of just portraying the beauty that we may get in a desert planet like Red Mars. I also enjoyed Kim Stanley Robinson's approach to hard science fiction. I did like that blend of, what is almost realistic science with a bit of a caveat that I'll talk to in a minute. But I did like the fact that he has done some research and he's tried to make it accurate. But by no means do I think that he's a scientist. But I did like that blend of the hard science, which makes the novel still a work of fiction, but a very believable one. I also enjoyed the shout out to Arthur C. Clarke in this novel with the use of a space elevator. So I enjoyed the way that Kim Stanley Robinson has sort of taken a practical use to what that space elevator that we learnt about in the Fountains of Paradise, which I've reviewed and I may link down below. He's made a practical use of what that space elevator could do in our attempts to colonize a planet like Mars. So I really did enjoy the science that went into that. Again, painting that blend of what is, hard science, believable science, but not necessarily accurate. The other thing that I enjoyed were the characters themselves. I like the way that Kim Stanley sort of presents a fair an unbiased view of both opposing views, both when it comes to terraforming, but also the personal views that both John Byrne and Frank Chalmers, the main protagonists in the novels, had. So I enjoyed the fact that he played that balanced view, and I did enjoy the interactions of the characters in the novel. I also enjoyed the great lengths that Kim Stanley Robinson went to sort of provide a balanced view of both sides of that terraforming argument. Should we terraform a planet like Mars, or should we leave it the hell alone and let it just do what it needs to do, and let's not destroy this other planet like we did our planet Earth? And then the opposing view that, man needs to go out there, we need to spread through the heavens and start colonizing these planets. And I enjoyed the hard science that it put into this again, balancing all the different techniques, which I thought was really interesting, right? Because it doesn't just have one way that we could actually solve this problem. I think which is probably accurate, which is, we really should be looking at this in multifaceted ways to see how do we actually go about terraforming a planet. So I like the fact that he's broadened his horizons and he's looking at not one, but a multitude of different ways that this could actually be achieved. Now, I've often cited this as a great terraforming novel and probably the pinnacle that, as far as I'm aware of that kind of genre of a novel, and I highly enjoyed it. But what are some of the things that I didn't enjoy? Look, I'd have to say that the science I think is really good, but it is very much fiction, right? So if you're a scientist and you're reading this book, I'm sure you'd be looking at it and thinking, well, yeah, he quickly dismissed this very technical, difficult challenge. And there's no way that this, lifetime of 100 colonists could have actually had the results that they had. So I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who work in these industries who would look at this book and say, yeah, the science just doesn't add up. Look, I'm only going to mention it in my dislike sections because I thoroughly enjoyed it. But I'd have to say the one hurdle, and I'm no scientist, right? But the one hurdle that I had in my mind is, yeah, a lot happens when it comes to terraforming this planet. And I wasn't convinced that we would be able to achieve something like that in the lifetime that this novel covers. Look, who knows? I'm no scientist, but I sort of struggled with that and I wanted to highlight it as part of my dislike section. But more than anything, it's really an observation, that one, because it didn't really take away from my full and thorough enjoyment of the novel. What I would also say is, look, the first part of the novel I really thoroughly enjoyed and it was very memorable, and we may talk to that when it comes to the memory test. But I got to say that the ending for me has always been a little bit anticlimactic when it comes to this book. It really is, for me, it almost reads like a history of the first colony on Mars, and for that I really rate it highly. But as far as the plot and the storyline goes, I'd have to say that it wasn't a huge, ending for me. At least I never really found it that way. I really do see it as an account of the first 100 and what life was like there, the events leading up to the revolution and what happened around that. But there was no real climatic I'm on the edge of my seat here waiting to read the the last 100 pages or so to get to the finale. So that was, look, it's not a disappointment. And I really can't recall the first time around how I felt reading the novel. But this time around, I sort of knew what I was getting into. I still remember the novel quite well. And it didn't have a negative effect on me. But I would say that there will be some people out there that would argue that the ending is a little bit weak in this. And in that, I would have to 100% agree. I don't think the ending was the actual, the highlight of this novel for me. The only other thing I would say is, I think that the last third of the novel was a little bit padded out. I think a little bit of editing would have made it for a better novel. But look, I also have to stress this, that whenever I read Red Mars, I read through it and I'm reading through it and I'm reading through it, and all of a sudden I'm on page 500. And it's stuck on a book that just flows. It really flows really well. I guess I should have mentioned that in my likes section. But I always find that this novel just flows. I think I get lost in the storytelling and the wonderful road trips that they go on in Mars. That cover a lot of ground on these rovers. That look something like that. So they cover a lot of ground on those rovers, and I think Kim Stanley Robinson is just amazing when he goes to describing the planet and what it looks like. So when it comes to the memory test, I must say that the first half of the novel, the events leading up to John Boone's assassination, are so memorable for me. I mean, I must have read this book. Actually, I remember exactly where I was when I read this novel. I was actually traveling for work. And it was 20 years ago. I remember almost to the day when I was reading this novel. And I must say that I remember the first half of the novel like it was yesterday. I remembered the characters' names. I remembered their conflicts. I remembered what they wanted to achieve, their dreams, their aspirations, the plot. I remembered pretty much the first half of the book uncannily, almost word for word. It was like really uncanny. But what I'd have to say is that the second half was not quite the same. That the revolution and what happened around the revolution and the actual ending, I honestly couldn't remember much of that. I remember there was a revolution, and I remember there was some kind of conflict with the planet Earth. But I got to say that part was nowhere near as strong as the first part. And it makes me wonder whether or not Kim Stanley Robinson should have just ended it at John Boone's assassination. But what about recommendations? Look, I've alluded to already in my review that if you're a fan of Arthur C. Clarke, especially the way he describes alien landscapes, I think you really will be pleasantly surprised, and you will enjoy Red Mars, because it definitely reminds me of the great work that Arthur C. Clarke does. Not to take anything away from Kim Stanley Robinson, I think he's his own person, and he's done a wonderful job in his own right. But the recommendation still holds. If you like Arthur C. Clarke's The Fountains of Paradise, I think you will enjoy the homage here to the space elevator and how it was used. You may recall when I reviewed Sands of Mars, I made a comment that if you really liked what you saw in Sands of Mars, but you were itching a little bit more about understanding, well, what are the challenges of the first colony? What are the challenges of terraforming a planet like this? What would be I want more. Well, and then I said, have a go at Kim Stanley Robinson. I may say the opposite of that is true as well, right? If you found this to be a big pill to swallow, I'd say have a look at Arthur C. Clarke's The Sands of Mars, and you might find a balance between the two. So look, the other novel that we've covered to date on this channel is Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Now, I wouldn't say the writing is the same. I think they're two very different novels. But The Moon is a Harsh Mistress did talk to revolution. So if you enjoyed that novel, Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, I say that a good, a third, almost a half of this book also talks to revolution in more practical sense, in more believable scenario as well. So I'd say have a go at Red Mars. You might enjoy that as well. Hey, so look, thank you for sticking around for that. We've got to rank it on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. So how about I flip the cameras around and we'll do that just now. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking tonight's Hugo Award-winning novel for 1993, Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars. Now this is going to be an interesting one to see exactly where it sits on the Shed Ladder here, because some of the criteria that I look is, how strong is the theme? How well was it executed? And I'd have to say that the themes were quite strong. I think some of the execution could have been a little bit better, but the themes were strong. The other thing I would say about the originality of it, I mean, it was nothing really original, but I just thought it was very well done, and he brought together a whole lot of different themes and concepts wonderfully together. But there was nothing really groundbreaking that were these are unique Kim Stanley Robinson ideas. So I couldn't see any in the novel that we haven't previously covered in the past. The other thing I look at is the characters. How well developed are the characters? And I did enjoy the characters. I enjoyed the interactions between the characters. And we did find that they did go through some journeys. Some of these people did definitely go through some journeys. So I thought overall the characters were good. I thought the plot there was a lot going on in the plot. I mean, we had, all the construction around the space elevator. We had the trip out to Mars and all the different issues we had around the selection process. We had the whole terraforming arguments for pro and against, the revolution, all the issues and problems happening on Earth. There's a big, good section of the book talks to religion as well, which I didn't really talk to in my plot overview. But there's just so much going on in the plot as well, which I found enjoyable. I say that the writing was good. It was very good descriptive writing. The only thing that really let it down for my giving it, 5 out of 5 stars was really only the ending and the latter part of the book that I thought was a little bit bloated. So it's going to be interesting to see where it sits on the shed ladder, because a good place to start would be Arthur C. Clarke's The Fountains of Paradise. And is Red Mars a better novel than The Fountains of Paradise? And part of me says, look, some aspects of it are. Some aspects are a better novel. But I'm going to give Arthur C. Clarke the edge, because that concept was really so much of what I enjoyed in this novel was the building of the space elevator, how that worked, practically how would that aid a colony world like Mars. So I'm going to have to give it to Fountains of Paradise just because of just how influential that book was and that concept was. So I'm going to give it to the Fountains of Paradise. The other novel that would be interesting to compare against is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Now that novel talked to revolution, but it also talked to artificial intelligence and the rise of sentient computers, right? And I thought it was just so far of its time, considering it was a novel written in 1967, that again I thought it had some really interesting concepts that I hadn't seen before. So I'm going to have to give it to Heinlein and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress over Red Mars, because again it just predated this novel for about 25 years, but I think some of the concepts were just right out there for someone who was writing in the 1960s. The other novel to compare it to would be Moving Mars by Greg Bear. That was also an interesting novel that did talk to some of the challenges on a colony planet like Mars. It went more into the politics and the family structure and some of the science that happened there. It's a very enjoyable novel, Greg Bear's Moving Mars. And is Red Mars going to be better or worse than Red Mars? And I think you already know, given the gap that's there. But I'm going to have to say, yeah, I enjoyed Red Mars overall more than I did Moving Mars by Greg Bear. Should it be higher or lower than that? Let's have a quick look. I still, like I said, I've said it so many times, I really did enjoy The Demolished Man. So it's going to be harder for me to put it above The Demolished Man. And yeah, I definitely enjoyed Red Mars more than Moving Mars. Hey, there we have it. Where would you have ranked it? Have you read it? Have you read the trilogy? I've read the trilogy, but it's been 20 odd years, like I said, since I've last read it. And so I'm really looking forward to reading Green Mars and Blue Mars. I would love to hear your thoughts. Where would you rank it? Is it truly somewhere in the middle of the bunch? Do you think it should have more towards the end, the top of the board? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you as always for joining me in the shed, and I'll see you next time in the shed.